welcome to Series 10, Episode 7 of In Suspense, a podcast and vodcast for fans and writers of crime fiction. I'm Nikki Smith, and my co-host today is Eleni Kyriacou. Hello, Lesley.
Hello, Nikki.
In our last episode, Julie Cohen shared her insights about writing in two different genres. She gave some great advice, so do check it out. She's absolutely incredible author, we thought. In today's episode, we're going to be talking to not one, but two amazing authors, Eleni Kyriacou and Emma Flint, about their latest novels, as well as our topic for today, which is true crime fiction. Should you and could you make a murderer likeable? Which is quite an interesting topic, I think. But before we go on, Lesley, how are you? What have you been up to?
Well, I've had some dental treatment this morning, so that's added to my stress levels because
I hate going to the dentist.
Yes, I'm just explaining to listeners why I'm stressed, because I couldn't get onto the Zoom this morning. So all sorts of things have been happening this morning. My computer's been playing up. My teeth have been playing up. No, anyway, I had some dental work this morning, so I'm still slightly numb. So if I sound a bit weird, then that's why it is. And I had some molds taken because I'm going to have teeth whitening. Not the really shiny white teeth. I said to the dentist, "Don't make me look like Ross in Friends." Do you remember that episode where
it'll be ding? People will be able to see us on YouTube, the effects. Yes.
But that was horrible, having the molds, and it really made me gag when they took the top one out. Anyway, I won't bore you with my dental work. What else have I been doing? Oh, cover reveal. I mean, I think you mentioned that on the last show, didn't you? But we've all had our cover reveals lately, so that was exciting. And apart from that, I had a lovely spa day. So that was, I mean, the relaxing spa day seems way behind me now. I've kind of, the stress levels have gone up since then. And sorting out my office and making it look a little nicer. So that's what I've been up to. And what about you, Nikki?
Well, I've been catching up on a lot of admin, actually. I think that's the thing with cover reveals. They're very exciting, but it then does mean that you have to kind of go back, doesn't it, and change your Twitter profile, update Facebook, update your newsletter, update YouTube. So it's all kind of behind the scenes stuff and not very exciting, but it takes forever. So I've been doing quite a lot of that. And I've just had through the postcard, a kind of mock-up, if you like, of the postcard that they're going to be sending out with proofs of the guests. So
lovely.
That's very exciting. Yes, I love it. It's just the cover really, but with a kind of design on the other side and things. So that'll be really nice. And hopefully they will be coming out for authors kind of towards the end of this month. So by the time this episode airs, they may well be with people. We shall have to see.
Yes, admin is it's a nightmare, really, isn't it? I mean, sometimes I like it, and sometimes it gets me down. I don't think I ever realised before I became a writer, an author, how much admin there would be.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's relentless, isn't it?
Yes. I mean, you could easily have. I mean, it sounds awful, and obviously we don't, but you could easily have a personal assistant, couldn't you? Because there is so much kind of answering emails and updating things and doing things that actually, I kind of thought, I guess, before I became an author, that you'd just be kind of sitting there writing every day, but that absolutely doesn't happen. It's
no, it doesn't.
A lot of admin. But shall we talk about our topic for today then? Yes. So it's true crime fiction and whether you should make a murderer likeable. So I think it's a really fascinating question, this. It looks at the whole debate around the idea of likability, which I actually think probably really means relatability for readers. I don't think readers have to like a murderer, but I do think that they have to be able to relate to them to enjoy reading a book about them, even if that book is a fictionalized version based on the facts of a kind of a real life case. So true crime doesn't have to make sense, and often, sadly, it doesn't, but true crime fiction does, and I think it's unsatisfying to the reader if it doesn't make sense. So the making sense of the crime gives the reader a resolution and a sense of order, I think, that we look for in our kind of stories that we like reading. But it doesn't come without problems. And when an author accesses the perpetrator's emotions or motivations, could we say that they're then seen to be kind of making excuses for the crime that they've got in that particular book? And I think over the past few years, authors have moved to try and focus more on the victims of the true crimes rather than the perpetrators. I think there's been quite a few books like that, like Notes on an Execution and things like that, which have been done really well, where it's definitely the focus has moved towards the victims rather than the murderer.
Yes.
But I still think the murderer needs to be relatable in some way in order for the reader to want to read about them. But what do you think? What do you think, Lesley?
Yeah, I agree with everything you've said. I mean, it isn't about liking the perpetrator, is it? But it's about finding something that's something intriguing enough about them to make you want to read on. And I mean, you know, nobody is all good or all bad, are they? And I think the best characters are flawed in some way. I mean, as long as we can understand their motivations, we don't have to like what they're doing.
Yes.
And maybe we don't fully understand it, but as long as we can find some sort of reasoning behind their behaviour that kind of makes sense, then we can perhaps, even if empathise is perhaps too strong, but we can find a degree of empathy, or we can find a degree of understanding for them on one level. I mean, I don't know about you, Nikki. I'm sure I'm not alone in this, but you'll tell me if I am, I'm sure. But I really enjoy writing from the point of view of the antagonist. And the worse they are, the better, actually. And I don't know whether that's sort of, you know, it's exercising your creative muscle, isn't it? Because it's putting yourself in the head of someone that's completely outside of your own personality and experience, hopefully.
Yes.
Hopefully most writers aren't murderers or nasty people. But yeah, there's something quite creatively fulfilling about writing from the point of view of someone quite bad.
Yes.
I don't know why that is. Why do you think that is?
I don't know why that is either. I mean, I think one of the characters in my last book, The Beach Party, I mean, everybody comments about her because she was so awful. But I think, as you say, there is something really fascinating about writing about a character like that. Maybe because they are so, some of the things that they do are so far removed from how you would behave that it's interesting exploring, I think, and the motivations of what makes somebody do something like that. That's what we all want to know, don't we?
Yes, but what you said earlier about there's a focus now on the focusing on a trend rather to focus on the victims, because I can't remember the name of the book or the writer. It was Hallie Rubenfeld writing about Jack the Ripper, but was writing about the women he murdered and their stories.
The Five, I think.
The Five. That's it. The Five. Yeah.
That was done brilliantly, actually.
Really was.
Yes. Well, how about we get Eleni Kyriacou and Emma Flint on to talk about their books, which both feature horrific true crimes, and ask them how they dealt with this dilemma.
I think that's a very good idea. Let's get them on straight away. Hello, Eleni and Emma. Welcome to In Suspense. Now, before we dive into our questions, we wondered if you would both please introduce yourselves to our listeners. So, Eleni, would you like to start by telling us a little about yourself? And it's no time for modesty.
Okay, I'll give it a try. Hello, everyone. My name's Eleni Kyriacou, and I am the author of The Unspeakable Acts of Zina Pavlou, which is a historical crime book set in 1954. It tells the story of a Cypriot grandmother who's here visiting her son in England, and she is accused of murdering her daughter-in-law. She doesn't speak any English, and she doesn't read or write Greek. So she is, the whole story is dealt with through the eyes of her interpreter, Eva. So it's really that story, and it's inspired by a true story, something that actually happened in 1954. And the translator in my book sort of immediately regrets taking the case on. She tries to figure out whether this woman, Zina Pavlou, has actually committed the crime. I'm really pleased to say the book has been chosen to be on BBC Two's Between the Covers in December, on December the 11th, and really looking forward to seeing what the celebrities make of that.
Yes, it's very exciting, isn't it?
Congratulations.
And
Thank
is it your first book, Eleni?
No, I wrote another book. My debut was called She Came to Stay, which was also set in the 50s. And it's about Cypriot immigrants coming to London. And that's also a historical crime. But this one's Zina Pavlou is a lot darker, a lot more crimey and very twisty.
Right. Oh, okay. And everybody, it's out now. It came out on November the 9th, I believe.
That's right, yes.
Out in hardback. And it's had some amazing reviews. Absolutely. As you said, it's going to be on Between the Covers on BBC Two, which is fantastic. And I was just looking at some of your reviews, and I love this one from the Times. Kyriacou's evocation of post-war London and the benighted attitudes of its citizens is worthy of Sarah Waters. I mean, what praise? That's praise indeed, isn't it?
I mean, I have to say I was thrilled with that. No idea what Sarah Waters thinks of it, but I'll take it.
Oh no, that's
I'm
fantastic.
Thrilled because she's a writer that I absolutely aspire to. So to be mentioned in the same sentence is great. Yeah, I'm very pleased with that.
And there's a whole load of wonderful reviews. So fantastic.
Thank you.
It's an incredible read as well, an absolutely incredible read. Emma Flint, now, would you like to introduce yourself to our listeners?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. I'm Emma Flint, and I'm the author of 2 historical novels that are both based on real murder cases. The first one, Little Deaths, is set in 1960s New York, and the second, Other Women, was published this year and is set in 1920s London. Other Women is about a love triangle between 2 women and a man that ends in a horrific murder. And it's based on a case that was headline news in England for several weeks in 1924, so almost exactly 100 years ago, but which very few people today have even heard of. And it's narrated by the 2 women, the wife and the mistress of a man named Tom Ryan, but Tom himself doesn't get a narrative voice.
Right. And it's soon to be featured on BBC Radio 2, isn't it, as a book club pick?
Yes, it was picked in February this year when it was published.
Brilliant. Okay, fantastic. Well, that's really, really, really great to welcome you both to In Suspense. We're delighted to have you both on.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I absolutely adored both of these books, both Other Women, and I've also read Little Deaths as well, but just these two, your 2 most recent books, I would say. Your writing is stunning, both of you, and I actually think that you write in quite similar styles as well, so that was really interesting. But I just wondered if you could tell us what inspired you to write about an actual criminal case rather than something entirely fictional. How closely did you stick to the facts of that original case when telling your story, and how far do you think an author has a responsibility not to stray too far away from the facts of the real case? And I wondered if, Emma, you'd like to start us off with that.
Sure. So when I was a teenager, I read a lot of true crime. Before there were podcasts, before there was Netflix, before true crime was a sort of really a genre. I was really fascinated by true crime. I wanted to be a pathologist originally when I was a teenager. I thought, and I guess I still think of pathology as being like a very pure form of detection, where the pathologist has the body and has to find clues about what happened and work back from the moment of death. Obviously, I didn't become a pathologist because I was pretty rubbish at science, but that's where the interest came from. So, and then when I realized that I wasn't going to be able to follow that career, I think I started becoming interested in the stories behind the cases. So I read In Cold Blood. I remember that making a huge impact on me and realizing that these cases weren't they weren't sort of dry scientific accounts of what had happened to someone that had ended up with them being dead, but the characters in the cases could be the source of really rich stories and rich narratives. And I remember reading In Cold Blood when I was about 22, and just it felt like it smacked me between the eyes and opened up all these different sorts of possibilities. So the case that inspired Other Women and the case that inspired Little Deaths were cases that I read about probably about 30 years ago. And in the case of Other Women, I remember being really struck by the fact that the man involved in the murder, who was a very attractive, charismatic, charming, photogenic man, was very much at the forefront of the case. So his face was all over the newspapers. The focus was very much on how was it possible that an intelligent, articulate, cultured, lower middle class man could have been involved in what ended up being a really, really gory, quite sordid, seedy case. There was a sort of sense of disbelief that this man could have been involved to the extent that the prosecution said he was. And I remember reading about this at the age of 14 or 15 and thinking, well, where are the women? Where's the victim? Where's the mistress? Where's the wife? He was having affairs with several women at the same time, which I found quite fascinating. The idea of this man juggling all these different lives, really, and lies. But I remember thinking, well, where are the women? And when I came to write the novel and sort of dug through all the newspapers, I still wondered, where are the women? The women were victims in the case, whether it was the victim of lies and manipulation or victims of a much more serious crime. So I was really I wanted to redress that balance, I think, and I wanted to give a voice to the women who were at the heart of the case, who hadn't been able to speak. And when I started researching it, I actually found that there was even very little about them in the police files, which shocked me. So yes, the wife in the case, for example, is pretty much completely made up. The only things I had to go on were her date of birth, the fact they had a child, and one tiny, awful photo of her, really, really small photo, sort of the size of a postage stamp, compared to the front page photos that he got.
Shocking.
That's so interesting, isn't it? Really interesting. Eleni, do you want to tell us something about what inspired you to write about an actual case?
Yeah, I mean, my book is very much inspired by the true case rather than based on, and I say that because there's a lot of stuff that I couldn't find out. And so at one point, kind of after a few months of working on it, I had to make the decision, okay, I'm going to fictionalize this, going to make this a bit different. But I've stuck to the facts of the crime and the facts of, as far as I can tell, what happened in court and all the newspaper reports. What inspired me was I went to an exhibition and I saw this quote from Albert Pierpoint, who was the famous executioner. And he'd been criticised for executing Ruth Ellis. A journalist had said to him, how could you hang a woman? There were huge protests when that was happening. He didn't say anything at the time, but in his memoirs, he said, I thought to myself, he said something along the lines of, I thought to myself, where were all these people 6 months ago when I executed a 53-year-old Cypriot woman? Or didn't she count because she was, I think his words were, foreign, not glamorous and old or something. I mean, she was 53, but hey, we'll let that one go. And I just thought, a 53-year-old Cypriot woman. I happened to be a 53-year-old Cypriot woman when I read this. And I thought, who's he talking about? The person that was executed before Ruth Ellis. And I just thought, who was that? So I looked it up and I found out about the true case, which was a woman called Stilu Christofi, who was accused of killing her daughter-in-law, Hella. And when I started looking at it, the way that she was depicted in the press was very much, I mean, there are only a couple of photos of her, and the reports, because the trial isn't available, but the reports of the trial are, and prosecution described her as something like a stupid peasant woman, something like a stupid woman. And, you know, the fact that she was illiterate and the fact that she was foreign was mentioned so many times. There was so much racism involved in this class, but also classism as well, and a lot of prejudice. And then I found some records in the files that suggested that she had mental illness. She had a mental illness. And then I started thinking to myself, well, firstly, did she do it? And secondly, was she in her right mind if she did do it? And that's where the story sort of took off, where I filled in the gaps. There's so much we don't know about her, about the real case. So I sort of changed names, and, you know, I made up a whole strand of what happened in Cyprus. I changed sort of certain details, but the case itself and all the facts are as they were, as far as we know.
Oh, that's absolutely fascinating and shocking, isn't it, that the women sort of were so poorly represented, you know, at the time.
I think what shocked me more than anything is that Ruth Ellis is a name that so many people know, and yet no one knows this other woman. And it was only 7 months before. And I just thought, how can that happen? How can, like Emma was saying, these stories get lost? The women get lost in the story. Absolutely. And, you know, it's just really interesting that these stories just fallen by the wayside. And so many people, even people who know a lot about true crime and know this, don't know this particular story. And so I was just really interested to sort of dig and find out a bit more about that and use it for the book.
I've always found
as you've both so sort of eloquently said, the stories in both books are told from the female perspective, one being the murderer's wife, Kate, and one being the translator in Emma's book, and one being the translator for the woman accused of murder, Eva. Despite the fact that the books are set in 1954 and 1923, respectively, when women were very much, as you've said, really were regarded as second-class citizens in so many ways. So I presume it was obviously a deliberate choice to write from the female perspective, as you've both said, to sort of tell their stories. But had you ever considered writing not solely from the male perspective, but to have some male characters' points of view, such as Tom in your case, Emma, or let's start with you, Eleni, Michalis in yours? Did you ever consider that?
I went on a course while I was writing this, and the male tutor said to me, I'm really interested in Michalis' story. That would be the main character's son. And I thought, I kind of hear what men think the whole time. I'm sort of interested in the women. The whole point of this for me was to reflect the friendship between Eva, the translator, and Zina, the accused, because what I wanted to show was that, you know, people's views of other people change. You know, you start off thinking, you know, Zina is this awful person who's committed this terrible crime, and along with the translator, hopefully you change your mind as you find out more and more about her, and things, like Emma was saying, they're not black and white. It's not just this happened, this person's guilty. It's like, what happened to that person to make them the way they are? And, you know, that's what interests me, all those nuances and, you know, the hidden women's stories. It would be a very different book to write it from a male point of view, you know, and that's something for someone else to do if they want to. But for me, I'm really interested in the women's stories, really.
Yes, absolutely. And Emma, and before I go on to ask you the same question, Emma, I meant to say earlier that your debut Little Deaths, because I don't think you mentioned it, was longlisted for the Bailey's Women's Prize for Fiction, wasn't it? So
it was.
We need to mention that, because as I said at the beginning, no time for modesty.
Great book.
Amazing. And Emma,
book.
Same sort of question for you, really. Did you ever consider having a male character's voice? You know, did you ever consider speaking in Tom's head, or was that completely out of the question with you?
I decided very early on that I didn't want Tom to have a narrative voice. As I said earlier, he was all over the newspapers, and I honestly felt that he'd had enough attention.
Yeah.
And
Rightly so.
I wanted the focus to be more on the women. So originally I wrote the story just from the point of view of the mistress, who was sort of my original narrator and the character who originally hooked me. But I quickly realized, for various reasons, which you'll find out when you read the book, that she wouldn't be able to tell the whole story. So I did spend quite a lot of time trying to work out who the other narrator would be. And at one point I thought about giving the policeman, who I have a real soft spot for, Detective Inspector Wilde, I thought about giving him a narrative voice. And I went to bed one night thinking about this problem. How was I going to tell the rest of the story? Who was my other narrator going to be? And I had a dream about Kate, about the wife. And in the dream, she was trying to phone me, weirdly.
Fantastic dream.
And thought, she's obviously got something she wants to say. She is my other narrator. And as I said, I had to make her up from scratch, because there really was nothing, considering the enormity of what her husband was accused of. There was absolutely nothing. There was one statement that I found in the Sussex archives, which I don't think anyone had looked at since 1924. And I found it, and I was overcome with excitement and joy. And I thought, oh gosh, I'll actually get to hear her voice. And when I read it, it was a very dry statement that had clearly been written by a police officer. And she didn't even sign it. The signature was typed. I couldn't find her as a person anywhere, so I had to make her up. And then I thought, yes, of course this is the right thing to do. I'm telling the story from the perspective of the two women who were most badly affected by this man. And yeah, as I said, he doesn't get a narrative voice. He gets to speak at the trial. He gets to give evidence, but the trial is seen from the perspective of witnesses. So when he's lying, the person who's narrating it is very clearly aware of the points where he's lying.
Yes, it's brilliantly written. Now our topic for today is whether you should make a murderer likable. So in your case, Eleni, the book is told through Eva, which is obviously the translator, and in yours, Emma, we only get to see the murderer through the eyes of his wife Kate and his lover Beatrice. And in Tom's case, he is, I guess, at least initially seen as a very attractive, charismatic kind of man by the other characters. But in Eva's case, she agrees to translate for and has a great deal of sympathy for, or she develops sympathy for, a woman who bludgeoned her daughter-in-law to death and burned her body.
Allegedly.
Allegedly.
A very important word, isn't it?
Anyway.
So did you want or intend to make your murderer likable for readers despite the horrific crimes that they committed? And Emma, do you go? Doesn't matter.
Go Emma.
I definitely did. So lots of women were attracted to Tom, either superficially or were in love with him because they knew him. And it was really important to me that he was an attractive, charismatic man, because otherwise readers wouldn't understand why these women felt so strongly about him that they were prepared to do things that sort of seem illogical and beyond comprehension. I didn't want the reader to feel that my female characters were stupid, so it was important that they would understand. I actually wanted the reader to sort of slightly fall in love with him at the beginning. And apart from wanting my female characters to feel, the reader to feel that they could identify with them, it was also important because there's no such thing as monsters, you know. It's not that if you came across a man like Tom, I mean, I'm sure we've all read true stories about men like Tom, men who gaslight and emotionally abuse and physically abuse and lie and manipulate and hurt women. And they don't look like monsters. They're just human beings. When I was writing Other Women, I watched a couple of Netflix documentaries about Ted Bundy, who was a serial killer lived in America. He confessed to around 30 murders, but investigators think he might have killed more women than that. Most of the women he killed looked just like his first girlfriend, so they were very attractive young women, late teens, early 20s, with really long, straight, dark hair, parted in the middle. And there was a reporter on the documentary who was saying that he'd gone to Ted Bundy's trial, and the front row of the public gallery was full of girls in their early 20s with long, straight, dark hair who looked exactly like the photographs of his victims that were on the board. And they were there out of a sort of fascination that, they thought he was really attractive. They thought he couldn't be guilty. A man who looks like that, who's educated and intelligent and articulate, can't have committed the crimes that he's accused of. And it's really important to me that people who do bad things don't look bad. There's this very simplistic view, and I think we're still guilty of it. When I looked at the comments on the awful Lucy Letby case, the nurse who killed those babies, there was still a sense of disbelief that someone who looked, I think one paper called her angelic, could have committed a crime like that. So yeah, it was important to me that that Tom was likable, and as Eleni said, there is no black and white in that sense. Everybody is made up of shades of grey.
Agreed.
And Eleni, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think this idea that there are monsters, again, like Emma, I just sort of challenge it. With the true crime that my book is inspired by, the person who was accused, Stila Christofi. There are a couple of pictures of her. She's a small, dark Greek woman, looks like she's scowling. And, she's described in the papers as this sort of, she's kind of like a swarthy peasant type. I mean, and it fits this idea that she would be this monster mother-in-law who kills her pretty young daughter-in-law. And that's what I wanted to do. I'm not so sure I'd use the word likable, but what I wanted to do was I wanted to challenge the idea that this woman who's accused of these terrible things, these unspeakable acts, is necessarily the person you think she is. And so what I try to do is to give the reader some sort of emotional connection with that person. So readers hopefully will start off thinking, gosh, she's an abomination. And then as they get to know her and they get to learn what's happened to her and they get to sort of see her for who she is and the connections she has, say, for example, the love she has for her granddaughter, the relationship she has with her son, what happened to her in Cyprus when she was younger, all these things, then you hopefully as a reader get an emotional connection. So I think how we can relate to people is not necessarily because they're likable, but because they're going through something we understand. So, for example, for Zina Pavlou, she has this sort of huge loneliness that weighs down on her. She feels abandoned. She's also a bit paranoid that everyone's out to get her. She feels completely by herself. And she's confused and bewildered and doesn't know what's happening in this world where she doesn't understand what anyone's saying. She calls it I think she calls it something like world of wet windowsills and dark corners, And, who hasn't felt that sense of sort of isolation at some point, or that sort of feeling of being an outsider? So that's what I try to do, rather than necessarily make her likable. I think make her someone who you can relate to on some level and see why she feels the way she does. So it's sort of just to challenge really what readers' perceptions might be.
Yes, yeah. Nikki and I had a brief chat about that when we did our little intro in the beginning before you joined us, and we agreed that it's not about likability, it's about relatability, isn't it? And finding that,
Exactly.
even if it's just a small degree of empathy that we can have, or at least just to be able to understand their motivations in some way and relate to them on one level. So you've explained that really well, both of you. You've kind of both touched on this really as to why you chose these particular cases to write about. You've talked about that, but how much research did you actually have to do? And when you're writing a novel, do you go looking for specific cases to base a story on or to be inspired by? Or do you wait for sort of a story to resonate with you in some way? How do you sort of go about that research process? Should we stick with you, Eleni, while...
Yeah. Well, I don't necessarily go looking for a particular thing. I mean, I do love the 50s. My parents came to England from Cyprus in the 50s. So I have this fascination with the sort of the glamour of the 50s and the poverty and the crime and that sort of juxtaposition, how it was a very hopeful time, but also a really dangerous time. And, just those stories of those two things. So, for example, Eva, my translator, also works at the Café de Paris. So I wanted to get a bit of glamour in there as well, and, just to have that sort of both sides of the era. But I think it's more about sort of finding something that sparks your imagination. For me, it was, just that quote that I saw from Albert Pierpoint. And for my first book, She Came to Stay, it's the story of a young immigrant girl who falls in with the wrong people. And that's inspired by the fact my mother came here in her 20s, didn't know anyone. And thankfully, things turned out well for her, but I often wondered what would happen had she fallen in with the wrong people or taken a wrong turn. So yeah, I think it's more about once you've decided on the story. As far as research goes, I did a load of research. You were asking about research, weren't you?
Yeah.
I went to National Archives. I found out about the case. Not all of it is available. Some of it has been redacted. Some of it is not available because there's still family alive. And there's all the police statements are there, the newspaper reports, the doctor's reports. I even found reports from the prison officers who were with her in a condemned cell, who were sitting with her all day, and they have to report if anything untoward or unusual happens. So any sort of erratic behaviour was reported, and so those things are fascinating. And from that, I did so much research, I had to stop myself doing more. I basically found everything I think that we have on her that is available. And then I thought, okay, how am I even going to get into this story? I just thought this is just such a very dark, very sad story. And I just thought, how am I going to make this a novel, really? And then I struck on the idea of having one female translator, because in reality, what happened to the woman it's inspired by, Stila Christofi, she had 3 different male translators. And in those days, translators weren't really, it wasn't regulated. So they literally were just people who spoke the language that the police had on a list. And they'd just say, okay, you speak Greek, can you come and do some work for 2 hours and we'll give you some money. But women did do the job. And I thought it'd be more interesting to have a woman in the centre of the book. And so we see their relationship progress, because it is also a story of a strange kind of bond and friendship. Yes. So so lots of research there, loads of research.
Fantastic. And Emma, same question for you, really. How do you approach your research? Do you wait for stories to resonate, or do you go searching them out?
So I said earlier that I read a lot of true crime when I was a teenager. So I have this sort of library in my head of real stories that I, kind of, when I'm looking, I guess when I'm coming to the end of a book, I'm thinking about what the next book will be, and I'm sort of mentally leafing through the library. For me, it's all about the character. I'm a slow writer, so it has to be a character or characters who I want to spend years with. So my first book took me 6 years to write, and by the end of it, I was dreaming about my narrator, the main character rather, Ruth Malone. The book's written in the third person. I was dreaming about her. I would walk into clothes shops to look for something for me, and I would see a top, for example, and think, oh, Ruth would love that. It was really weird. It was like being in a really intense relationship, and then when the book ends, the relationship breaks up, and there's a kind of grief. You have to let them go, and you have to let them out into the world. So for me, it's always about the character. It's about do I find this person interesting, not necessarily likable. I don't think any of my characters are 100% likable, but are they relatable, and can I make them relatable to readers, is where I start from. And with Beatrice, who's the mistress in Other Women, B for short, when I reread the story in my 40s, I was really struck by this woman. She was 37 at the time of her death, and 37 in 1920 was not far off sort of mid-40s, which is the age I was when I started writing the book. She was an intelligent, educated, independent woman with hobbies and friends and interests and passions, and I wanted the reader to feel that she might be the kind of woman that they would be friends with now if they met her. And my question, so there's always a question, I think, when you start a book. My question was, why would a woman like that, who had so much in her life, why would she risk losing all of that to have an affair with a man who she knew was married? And she wasn't just risking her her social position and her friendships and her reputation, but they worked together. And if their affair had been discovered, she would definitely have been the one who lost her job. He probably wouldn't. And at the time, 1923, 1924, by having sex with a man who was never going to be able to marry her, and contemplate, if she'd got pregnant, if she'd contemplated abortion, there was no safety net of the welfare state. There was no legal abortion. She was literally risking her life for this man. And I found that really fascinating, because I identified with her in so many ways, but I couldn't identify with that. So my question was, why did she behave that way? You asked about research. I think I have a tendency to do too much research because I want to get it really right. I feel a real obligation to these women who really existed to get the facts right.
Yes, I was going to ask you about that. I was going to ask you whether you both think you have an obligation to present true crime fiction in as accurate a way as possible, because you're obviously using your imagination and creativity as well for the bits that you don't know.
Yeah, definitely. I especially with Other Women, I felt I wanted to convey this sense of a relatable life that was interrupted by her death, and I wanted the reader to feel a really strong sense of loss. So I did lots of research, not just about the case, but about the period. I really immersed myself in detail and language and literature and films, and I listened to recordings in the British Library of people, because they spoke very differently at the time. Obviously, we have far more of an American influence now in the way that we speak. Some of the pieces of research that I did were just glorious. There's a part in the book where Tom takes Beatrice away to this cottage for a romantic weekend. She hopes it's going to be a romantic weekend, and they found the cottage through an advert in the paper, like a little classified ad, and I found the actual advert that they had seen. And knowing that they had both read this advert, I was in tears. I felt just such.
It's given me a chill. That's so.
That's magical, isn't it?
Yeah.
I started sobbing in the British Library over a piece of newsprint, and I felt such an identification with her at that point. And I thought, I have to do this properly. I have to tell her story with respect.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. And would either of you ever consider basing a novel on a more recent case, or is that too fraught with complications? Because I think, in terms of family, friends being still alive, what do you think about that, Eleni?
I'm less interested in procedural stuff, and I suspect the more recent cases you'd have to include loads of that. So probably not. I like the fact that there is some stuff I know and some I don't. And while I feel a huge responsibility to the women to portray the case as it was, I did also give myself permission to kind of, because there's so much I didn't know. I had to give myself permission to go, okay, this is fictionalized. I'm going to change names. I'm going to do this as a story, right? And you base it on these facts. So yeah, I mean, I think for me, what really matters is that it could have happened this way. Do you see what I mean? So there was an element in court, for example, for me that we don't know about. Why did something happen? So having spoken to experts in the field, find out, yes, it could have happened that way. And as long as I get that accurate, then I'm okay. What was your original question, Lesley?
The original question was just whether you've answered it. It was whether you would ever consider basing a novel on more recent events. So
I think not. I think not for me. It's not my. I'm sort of more drawn to things that happened longer ago anyway. Yeah.
Okay.
Is that the same with you, Emma? Would you ever consider recent cases?
I don't think I'll ever write a book that is set more recently than Little Deaths, which was 1965. Sort of, I guess, for the same reasons as Eleni. It's partly because I'm more interested. I like the research process. I'm more interested in recreating the 1920s for someone who obviously hasn't experienced it. There are cases that I'm interested in from the 70s and 80s, but I think I would be a bit overwhelmed by knowing that there are still people alive who are grieving for people who were killed during those cases. I think that sense of responsibility would cloud the writing. And also, I think when you're writing about something that's in living memory for a lot of readers, you have a more difficult challenge because they're obviously coming to the story with their own preconceptions about the case, the stories, the characters, because they remember it themselves. Whereas you can sort of you can almost start from scratch with a case that's further back.
Yeah. And when you set out to write the book, did you think about the impact it would have on readers or society? And did you hope for it to have a particular impact?
Who's that for? Is that for me or for Emma?
And both of you, but Emma, you start.
I didn't sort of sit down at chapter 1 and think I'm going to write a worthy book that will make people think. I think
I did.
I know, but as I was writing it, I did feel what I really wanted to do was, especially with the ending of the book, was make people feel a sense of loss, was make people feel the impact of obviously none of them knew the woman who was killed, but I wanted them to really grieve for her and feel this sense of loss, because I was aware that obviously there's no one alive who remembers this woman, and she's kind of become a footnote in true crime in the same way that Bundy's victims have. Nobody remembers the names of his victims. They remember him in court and how dramatic and melodramatic and colourful and charismatic he was. They don't remember these women, and they don't think about what they might have gone on to do. And that makes me really angry, because these men don't deserve to be remembered. So I wanted to have a sort of sense of loss and a sense that there were people who cared about her and loved her and would miss her. So I'm not on a sort of one woman crusade, because I'm not the only person doing this, but I do think there's the focus in crime fiction, TV, film and literature has moved from these faceless women on autopsy slabs to trying to make them into three-dimensional figures with a life, and people who will grieve for them and miss them. I can remember reading an interview with an actress where she said, I'm refusing to play any more characters who are just victim number 3. And I think we've all seen films and dramas like that. I think there's a much more of a focus now, especially in crimes where the victim is female, where we're trying to recreate we're trying to recreate that life. And when I say the victim is female, I don't just mean the murder victim. I mean, in some ways, I think, Ruth in Little Deaths, who's accused of murder, in some ways she was a victim of certain systems. And I've always felt with the case that you've written about, Eleni, that I'm so glad that you've written this book, because I had heard about it and I've never found any fiction about it. And I really wanted to know what was going on, because it was portrayed as such a black and white case.
Yeah.
And she was evil and monstrous and horrific. And I've always wondered, well, people don't behave like that out of the blue. It doesn't come from nowhere.
No, I know. I mean, I never really I'm not setting out to have a huge impact in any lofty way, but what I did set out to do was to ask questions about, things we think we know. So we think we know this woman is an evil mother-in-law, killer, terrible peasant type. And it's like, okay, hold on a minute. Let's challenge all of that, and I know very little of what happened to her in Cyprus. What I do know is that she was married at the age of 14 to an older man. And I mean, what does that do to you? And as I won't spoil the plot, but there's something else that happens in Cyprus that is a huge, momentous event that obviously affects her massively. And I always think when you see someone who's considered evil, I just think that person was a child at some point. That person at some point started off as kind of a blank page. And I do believe we're all products of what happens to us. And, I think my intention, rather than having an impact, is really I like the playing with readers and getting them to change their mind and their sympathies. And they just, the feedback I've had is, I just don't know what to think. I don't know whether I want her to be found guilty or not, that kind of thing. And I like the fact that you think perhaps she did do it, but you actually are also worried that she perhaps did it, because then what's going to happen to her?
Yeah.
I think we're both challenging a narrative that the press gave the public, because there's a huge difference in how the woman that you fictionalized, the killer in your novel, was portrayed by the media, and obviously the way that you've portrayed her. But if you compare her with, for example, Ruth Ellis or Edith Thompson, or killers where the murderers, where the press was sympathetic, there was a huge wave of public sympathy which followed that sympathetic press. So I guess we're both challenging that narrative.
Yeah.
Okay, so finally, well, not quite finally, but what's next for you both? Can we expect another book based on historical true crime from both of you? And if so, can you tell us anything about it? Or is it still in the embryonic stage?
Mine's here. It's all in my head. I probably shouldn't say that. My editor doesn't want me to say that. Anyway, no, I am writing something else. It's set partly in the 50s. It's going to be set somewhere in London and Hollywood, and it will feature true crime. I wanted to write something that wasn't set in a prison, so I thought, what's the opposite? I'll do it in Hollywood. I just wanted to do something a bit more glamorous. So yeah,
fantastic.
That's probably about as much as I know.
Fantastic. What about you, Emma? Have you got another one in the offing?
I've got 2 more planned out, but the one I think I'm going to write next, just because it's very different to what I've done so far, is it's very dark. It's set about 200 years ago, and it's not about it's about the relationship between parents and a child, rather than a sort of husband-wife relationship or lovers relationship. I hope it's going to be very different from the other two, and I've started researching it, and I've started experimenting with the voice, and I'm actually having a lot of fun with it. So we'll see.
That's always a good sign, I think, isn't it? If you're enjoying it, then, because you live with it for so long, don't you?
Absolutely. And finally, we love to ask our guests what they're reading right now and that they might want to recommend to our listeners. So shall we start with you, Emma? Or something you've read recently, perhaps?
So, unfortunately, at the minute, I'm reading a lot of, I'm doing research for my next book. So I'm reading a lot of non-fiction about 19th century Britain, early sort of Georgian Britain. And I'm also reading novels that were written at that period. So I'm reading Oliver Twist right now, which I am.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Excellent.
Loving.
Yeah.
It's a long time since I've read any Dickens. And I've got Frankenstein lined up next to read, just because I want to really immerse myself in the writing. If you ask Eleni next, I will have a think about.
No, don't
I've
worry.
read
That's
Okay.
more than enough.
That's
Oliver
good, that's
Twist
good.
and Frankenstein. They must be firsts on the recommendations on this show, but both brilliant books.
Yeah.
What about you, Eleni?
So I recently read a book that really bowled me over. I just thought it was so good. It's a friend of mine called Susan Allott, and it's a book called House on Rye Lane. And I think it comes
telling
out in
Liz-
January.
Telling
and
Lesley
it-
about it. She's got a
Oh,
proof
were you?
now. Yes.
It's
I've got
just-
a proof of it now
it's,
to read. Yeah.
It's worth reading. It's so good. It's set. It's 3 different generations in one creepy Gothic house, and how this house kind of retains all their secrets and all the terrible things they do there. It has just got the best atmosphere I've sort of read in a book, and just the whole feel of it is so creepy. It's brilliant. So it stayed with me. I read it a month or so ago on holiday, and I loved it. And the other thing I'm reading is I really like Claire Keegan, and I'm just reading this at the moment, which is Antarctica, which is her short stories. The first one is a bit like, I read it and I was like, oh, okay. And I had to put it down for a bit. If you read it, you'll see what I mean. But I'm going back to that. But I'm trying to read things that are a bit, I'm sort of not quite in my research yet. So trying to read things that are a little bit different. But then I'm going to sort of throw myself into movie star biographies and things like that.
Oh, that'll be fun, won't it?
Wow.
Oh, it's
Hopefully, yes.
it's funny that you mentioned Claire Keegan, because my sister-in-law was recommending her to me the other day, and she'd recently read a story that was published in the New Yorker, and she recommended that I read it. I can't remember what the story was called, but
she wrote Foster, which is the other very slim sort of novella, and the one that won the awards, These Small Things, is that what it's called?
Yes.
Anyways, I mean, beautiful writing. My books are not short, and I'm amazed by anyone who can do what she does in so few words and create such an amazing story.
Yes, it's a real skill, isn't it, to write short fiction. What about you, Nikki? What's on your radar?
I am currently reading a proof of the final act of Juliet Willoughby, which is Ellory Lloyd's new one. And yes, I'm about halfway through and I'm loving it so far. It's very gripped. So I shall report back in our next episode, because I'll hopefully have finished it by then. How about you, Lesley? What are you reading?
I'm reading 2 proofs. I'm reading Graham Bartlett's third novel called City on Fire, which I'm really enjoying. And he's, Graham Bartlett's a brilliant crime novelist, and he's also a police advisor and has helped me and many countless other authors.
He's so good. Yeah.
He writes so brilliantly about police matters, absolutely perfect writing. So thoroughly recommend his books. And I'm also reading, I've been sent The Escape Room, which is a proof, and it's written by L.D. Smithson. 8 contestants, 1 killer. Are you ready to play? So that sounds rather exciting as well.
Excellent. Well, sadly, very sadly, that's all we've got time for. So I want to say a big thank you to Eleni and Emma for all your fantastic answers and coming on to chat to us today. The Unspeakable Acts of Zina Pavlou, for anyone who hasn't heard about it, is already out and you can buy it, as is Other Women. And I think Other Women comes out in paperback on the 1st of February next year. So go and grab copies of both books because they're completely brilliant.
Oh, they really are. You're both fantastic writers, and we thoroughly recommend your books to our listeners. Now we've got our final agent minisode coming next week, which I believe is about what to do when you're thinking about changing agents. So if that's you, then you might want to tune into that minisode. And if you've enjoyed the podcast today, don't forget to like and subscribe and leave us a review, as long as it's a good one. We don't want any nasty reviews. So if you don't like us, don't write a review. But if you do like us, please do, and we'll be really happy. But for now, it's goodbye from Eleni Kyriacou.
Thank you. Goodbye.
And goodbye from Emma Flint.
Thank you. Thanks for listening.
And it's goodbye from Nikki Smith.
Bye.
And goodbye from me. Bye-bye.